Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Mikhailishvili. I'm CEO and co-founder of Amedea Pharma, an agency that provides analytics and organizational change services to the life sciences. Well, with so many new ways to communicate with physicians and the healthcare community, as well as technology, we now have a chance to improve healthcare quality together. Yet, with the plethora of choices to make medical decisions, they also limit us in how we interpret the critical healthcare data in order to make sure that our patients have the optimal treatments at the right time. And we know that medical affairs teams race the anchor leg of the information relay that ultimately guides critical medical decisions. However, the rules and formats of that relay are changing constantly. So today, I'm excited about redefining what true partnership from the industry perspective with HCPs and patients really means. And so we have guest speakers today who are joining our regular crew that has been bringing you our monthly webinars here at Amedea Pharma. We're live now on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. And so we welcome questions. And I want to introduce my guest speakers, Sandra Walker and Eddie Power. They are guests, and Jeff New is also joining us as well. Sandra Walker is a CEO of Viacern Group, an industry executive for decades. Her last role was at Genentech, where she was the head of operating excellence, commercial, medical, and government affairs. She's an upcoming TedX speaker also, has had multiple leadership roles at other companies as well, large pharma companies. And we also have Eddie Power, who's the CEO of Empower Medical, has 20 years of experience in leadership, most recently Vice President of Global Medical Affairs for North America at Pfizer, as well as other roles in GSK in marketing. He's a lecturer at King's College in London, also GKT Medical School. And so we welcome our two guests. Jeff New, so he has years of experience in leadership in medical affairs, operations, field medical information roles, most recently Director of Digital Innovation at Novartis. And so I welcome all of you. And so I want to ask our speakers to just quickly say hello to the audience and tell us why this topic is important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to get started, Tim?
Sure, Sandra. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. It's such a pleasure to be part of this. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm so thrilled to have a chance to speak with everyone and would welcome the opportunity to really make this a dialogue and hear lots of questions from the group. Like Tim mentioned, I've been in the industry, pharma, biotech, diagnostics for more than 30 years. And just passionate about the work that we do, particularly around partnerships with HCPs and patients. I think it's really the core of why we do the work we do. And I did leave the industry last fall to found Viacern because I really saw a need around what we could do with senior leaders and board members around collective leadership, high-performing teams. How do we make excellent decisions so that we can really keep that purpose at the heart of what we do and do the best that we can for the patients and the customers that we serve. So I'm very passionate about this topic and really excited to get into the discussion.
Wonderful. Eddie?
Hello, everyone. Eddie Power, like Tim said, CEO of Empower Medical. I've got 25 plus years experience in pharma in various roles. I've worked across all regions of the globe and most recently, as Tim said, in North America. Passionate about medical affairs and how pharma in particular can become better at communication, given the plethora of information that's out there, the number of different channels, misinformation as well, which is very close to heart when I was working in vaccines. And really a privilege to be part of this panel as well and just share our thoughts, share learnings, share our experiences, and ideally also hear back from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. Jeff?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Tim. My name is Jeff New. I've been pleased to join Tim on a few of these webinars. So glad to be back and excited to hear what our guests have today. And I also have about 25 years plus in medical affairs, operations, all aspects. So this is something I care a lot about, and I'm interested to hear the discussion.
Wonderful. Why don't we get started and talk about our three agenda items here. Right, we're going to start talking about what medical decisions really entail today in this changing environment, how that has really transformed and evolved over time. Also deconstruct why it is that we're not always partnering in the most efficient ways with the decision makers, who are HCPs as well as patients in many cases. And then talk about some strategies as well. Innovative strategies from the experiences and perspectives of our speakers, as well as the ANCORA platform, decision assistant strategy, and performance intelligence for medical affairs. And so I want to start by talking about how the landscape is really changing today and get your perspectives. Eddie, would you like to kick us off?
Yep, absolutely. Do you want to go to the next slide, Tim?
Sure.
Yeah, so I think, one of the things that has struck me over the years working in pharma and primarily medical affairs is that often our thinking and engagement has been quite binary. It's been, here's my medicine or my device, here's the data that I have on it, and I'm going to communicate with you as an HCP or potentially through to a patient. But we often forget how complex the healthcare system is. And if you look at this map, this was put together by the Senate at the time of the Affordable Care Act. And when you look at it, it's like, where's Waldo? Try and find the patient or the healthcare provider in this complex system. So this is a very macro level, but it led me to think, and in my leadership roles, that we really needed to adopt more systems thinking. And then once we had that awareness, that knowledge, the interoperability of all these different levers in there, that we could become much more effective and really understand the context in which our medicines, our devices are being used, who's taking the decisions, and how those decisions impact, at the end of the day, patient care. So this is at a very macro level. The next slide, I kind of distilled it down into more of a system and process thinking, and you don't need to focus on the R's. This is just systems nomenclature for feedback loops, reinforcement loops, and all of that. But typically, if you look towards the top right of that, you'll see patients and intervention, which is traditionally what pharma has focused, and maybe a little bit around preventive care if you have worked in therapeutic areas like vaccines. But often we've tended to ignore, at least as medical affairs organizations, the rest of what happens to make that system actually work. Who's making those decisions? It could be financial, it could be policy driven, it could be access, it could be contracting, but all of those impact what actually gets used or prescribed, and what gets consumed by the patient at the end of the day. And then quality on the bottom right, I think it's a really important aspect. And how do we measure quality of our interactions and our engagements with the healthcare providers becomes really, really critical. And then on the next slide, Tim, what I kind of think of, like from my team, is to take all of that macro complexity and kind of distill it into a more digestible picture that really focuses more on our engagements with healthcare providers. And I've mapped it out in terms of process, procurement, and who the healthcare providers that are really interacting at each of these stages, and understanding, right, that there are going to be other players and other actors that impact on this. So procurement, one may be supply manufacturing, it could be PBMs, it could be wholesalers, it could be pricing and reimbursement. But then as you go around this circle, you can really begin thinking as a medical affairs professional, whom do I need to be interacting with? How do I focus and tailor my communication? And which part of the process do I really want to engage with in order to educate, in order to inform, in order at the end of the day to make sure that what we are providing is beneficial both for healthcare providers and patients. So I think that's just my summary and my take, Tim, over the environment that we're all operating in.
Sure, thank you, Eddie. So what would you highlight, Sandra, based from your experience and perspectives on how healthcare is changing?
Yeah, absolutely. Be happy to share. And I do think this systems approach is definitely the way to go. And I think medical plays a really crucial role in holding the system together. So particularly in my last role was responsible for, how do we get 4,000 people working well together within a commercial organization? And I think everyone has a role to play. But if we really put the healthcare provider truly at the center, they often aren't thinking, who am I talking to in medical? Am I talking to someone in medical affairs? Am I talking to an MSL? Am I talking to a salesperson? They want to speak to the company and get the answers that they need as quickly as possible. So the more that each member of the team can understand how the system is interacting and where the decisions are being made, then they can better add value, right? So I think that the more that we can help our organizations to understand this, and medical often plays a really leading role in this, right? They often get into the commercialization space the earliest. They start to shape the system. And so to truly be able to have influence over how we might be able to make decisions and some of the algorithms that physicians are using now to start to make these clinical decisions, it's so important. And so the more that we can help them do that and understand the nuances, the better. Oh, Tim, I lost the sound for you. I don't know if it's just me.
Can't hear you.
Okay, there we go. Okay,
Oh, that's
great.
better. Could you say that, please?
Yeah, so we're getting some comments here from our industry audience. So there's one question here that we will address in a little bit regarding metrics and indicators, but from Layla Coopersmith. We'll make sure to address that in the Q&A. And so you talked about the HCPs and the effectiveness of our interactions with them, and so we have some feedback from them from a recent survey from Viva Medical Systems, and it's very clear that they want to partner with the industry. In fact, they want to solve problems together based on this survey. Okay, but in terms of how we define what our impact is on the patient outcomes and what we want to measure versus what we really are measuring, there is there are gaps that continue to persist. Yeah, right. And we don't consider ourselves very successful as an industry in measuring our outcomes, our ultimate impact. And we want to measure how we change clinical practice, right? And how our physicians improve their quality of healthcare as well. So that's certainly supported by the evidence and most recent research as well. So physicians are using various different ways and technologies, as we all know. And how is that changing from their perspective, from HCPs? Can we get into a little bit more detail? Sandra, would you like to maybe take a stab at this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really see that there's a few different ways that this is changing. And I saw that note in the comment, particularly around information overload as well. So we can certainly talk a little bit about that. But there's so much more information that's available now for physicians and for patients that are out there. And it really is increasing the complexity of how they make decisions, both in terms of the direction with some of these algorithms in the systems, but also just noise, right? I mean, I think we're all dealing with the fact that there's a lot coming at us, and physicians are no different in that space. And so I think we need to be mindful of that as we're providing information to make that a very tangible way that cuts through some of that noise. In terms of the AI systems that are happening, I again think that we can actually help them to make more evidence-based recommendations. It shouldn't replace what they're doing in terms of their clinical decision-making. And I think the more that we can help them to use the human in the loop and really look critically at the information that we're providing them, I think that can help a lot. And then in terms of patients as the decision maker, I think we often think that the more data people have, the more insights they have, but that's often not the case either. And so while I think patients are in some ways more educated than they've ever been, the reality is that I think we just need to provide them more ways to do critical thinking and not just provide them with additional data. And I think physicians play a really important role in that.
And Eddie, any comments on just how we can continue to be critical thinkers as healthcare providers as well?
No, absolutely. We're going back to our discussion, and Sandra and I had comments on the system. One of the things that's happened today, right, is that the whole process of information sharing and communication has become democratized. When I started in medical school, it was all done through a very restricted funnel of scientific publication, and there were only a few experts who really had a platform. But now, fast forward to today, that any physician, clinician, healthcare practitioner has a valid opinion and has a platform in which to share that opinion. Then similarly, you've got patients and caregivers also expressing their own opinions. And it's really trying to work your way and think through what is really grounded in fact and data, and trying to weed out misinformation or disinformation in many cases. So for me, And I hear the term, complexity quite a lot. To me, the complexity isn't really around the clinical management or the decision making. There's always going to be new options to manage or treat patients. The complexity is more around deciphering what is of value and what is impactful and will really change patient care. So those are just some of my thoughts as we think through what engaging with healthcare providers and the patients they care for really entails.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are certainly new limitations, which we alluded to earlier, to really interpreting that data. And I want to share a few of the recent barriers or gaps from the perspectives of 16,000 patients that were surveyed across 16 countries by the Edelman, Trust Edelman Barometer. And so I took a look recently at the latest data from April 2024. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, it looks like despite the new different ways, patient portals, medical concierge services, and health systems, and ways to communicate between patients and physicians and the industry, the trust is still continuing to decline. And it seems like this is a result that's quite consistent across the globe. Misinformation that you spoke about, you both, spoke about, is also evident in terms of 41% of patients who will regret the healthcare decisions they've made because of various product advertisements, friends and family, or user-generated content that they may be browsing online, for example, right? And it's particularly pronounced in the age group of 18 to 34, as you can see from this research. But this particular finding is one that's probably very intriguing in particular. And I'm sure it'll generate some comments here from our audience and our speakers, because despite the use cases of AI in drug development and across the various different aspects of the industry and functions, there's still a lot of skepticism, it seems like. And so it's very important to understand what the best fit for the product is and for the technology. And so 55% are still concerned that technology will worsen healthcare. And if in terms of who our patients trust, it's really it's themselves and their primary care providers mostly, and they have less trust in the healthcare systems, and which is somewhat of a worrisome trend, right? And so I want to ask Sandra to talk about what's causing some of these findings that we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that we could really get into the details of this around the illusion of connectivity, right? So and what the value is. So I think realistically, we're coming at this from different angles. And so, oh, sorry, I thought, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. When we look at the root causes of why this isn't working, this idea of illusion of alignment between pharma, HCPs, and patients, it's really how they make decisions is very, very different, right? So there's some that are focused on the clinical efficacy, the market access, the regulatory constraints. That's really where pharma's coming at it. But if you look at what the value is from a healthcare provider, they really make their decisions based on workflow and patient outcomes and liability. But then when we get to patients, they really care about quality of life, personal values, and then you can even add payer in there. And so when we think about the root causes of why we're not collaborating, one of the key ones is this misalignment around our value systems. And I think we often think that we're much more aligned than we potentially were before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's delve into that a little deeper, Sandra.
Sure.
What you mean by that?
Yeah, I would love to talk more about that, because I think particularly as we come at this as what can medical do, we really want to think through how are we spending our time? Where can we add the most value? And as we're interacting particularly with HCPs, understanding the value that they really need to have and how these differences between how their goals are aligned can really make a difference in terms of how we speak to them, right? So, and also how we're connecting with our other colleagues. So if we're talking around speaking with people who are speaking with payers, they're also going to have a different value proposition. And we really need to tailor what we're doing and how we're talking to them to keep that misalignment in mind.
We have a comment, actually, Sandra, I want to share with you, and Eddie as well,
Yes, yeah.
from Carol Scrafton. She heads up a patient advocacy association for many years. So she acknowledges the misinformation and, from patients that Eddie spoke about earlier. Wanted to make sure to share that for our audience. So we spoke about the misalignment of goals there, and addressing the underlying psychology behind decision making, as you talked about. What about the trust and persuasion problems?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think that through, I mean, we often come at this with a rational argument. I mean, I think this is one thing that pharma has traditionally done, is to say, we have this data, so why wouldn't you agree? And I go back through the data. I can show you exactly why this is statistically relevant for you. But the reality is, when we make decisions, it's often really an emotional or social decision as well as logical. So I think as we start to think through, how do we persuade, and with the best intentions, right? To persuade, to say, how do we cut through some of this misinformation and help people to truly understand what's going to make a clinical difference, understanding how the decision is made, where the decision is made in that very messy system that we talked about at the beginning, can be really, really helpful to add the most value when we're having these conversations. And I do think that when we think through, how do we help people change? And I've led wide scale organizational changes, right? There's ways that we can make it easier for people to do something new. And so when we ask HCPs in particular to take on a new model of care or a new way of thinking, understanding what might be holding them back can be really important. So one of the things is to think through the cognitive biases that come in when you're making decisions. And one of them is status quo bias, right? So that's, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm familiar with that. I understand it. It's much easier to do that. And there's momentum to that. So knowing as we go in and really try and have them help them to do something different and new, understanding that. And then reactance bias as well, is that sort of, I want to have control over this. So the more that you can have physicians feel like they're empowered, help them to see how they can be part of the solution and really use this information to create the best patient experience and care, that can be really helpful in terms of having them do something new. And so I think just keeping these things in mind, and as you're having these conversations, to understand how might they be making decisions and how can we help to make that decision easier to get the best possible outcomes.
Anything else you'd like to add in terms of the patient engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this one, again, is really interesting when you think about it through sort of the frames in which we see the world, and that's ultimately how we decide. And so this is this concept around more information doesn't necessarily equal behavior change. And so I think the more that we can do to provide really tangible education that's action driven, what do we actually want people to do with this information, the sort of so what behind it, and really help people to lead to the changes that are really going to help their health. This is important. And then framing is really key. And I think this is one that people have often heard in the past, but this concept of, you can say something like 80% survival, or you can say 20% mortality. And they're exactly the same, right? But I think the way that you frame it can be really, really important. And the reality is, we don't often, as industry, spend a lot of time talking directly to patients. Occasionally we have the tremendous opportunity to do that, but who we do talk to is healthcare providers who then speak to patients. So the more that we can equip them with these sorts of ideas, framing, ways of speaking that can really help patients to engage in their care and understand the information in a realistic way, can be so helpful, and just understand all the factors that are happening. It's not just logic alone that drives these behaviors. So really being cognizant of the whole person and how they're involved in the process. And technology, of course, that we're all excited about, or many of us are anxious or skeptical about, to this day, as far as to my knowledge, it does not have emotions, does not express emotions, nor it has its own innate reasoning. Not yet, at least not yet. And I'm glad to see that. And so I think you bring up lots of great perspectives and those factors that drive behaviors and decisions that are more than just logic. So Eddie, what I'd love to get your opinion very briefly on Sandra's perspectives there.
No, absolutely. So maybe I can start with trust. And I always like using analogies, right? It's like kind of storytelling, and just to put things in context. Because the question that I always ask myself about pharma, and we've seen these surveys around trust. If you think about what I eat and my diet, right? I always ask myself, would I go to a fast food chain to get advice on my nutrition or my diet? And my answer is always no, I wouldn't. And that's in essence what pharma's expecting healthcare providers and patients to do, right? That they go to them for disease area advice or therapeutic area advice. So it's always trying to frame, where can pharma really add value? And it of course is around their medicines, their devices, because they've taken that through from conception. They understand all the data, the nuances. They have information that is not in the public domain, but they can communicate, right, if solicited. So it's always, for me, it's trying to find that kind of sweet spot and that confluence where there's that kind of information that leads to better decision making and better patient outcomes.
Mhm.
The other bit that I really liked that Sandra highlighted was that 80% survival, 20% mortality, because we often make the mistake of communicating data like that. But if I've worked in infectious disease for many years, I started off in a teaching hospital in what was called the Department of Clinical Microbiology. But if you present with an infection as a patient, it's not 80% or 20%. It's a zero-sum game, right? You're either cured or you're not. And it's kind of trying to take that percentage type of information and data and tying it to the demographics in which those studies were done, and then putting that in the context of a healthcare provider. We studied this type of patient. Do you have this type of patient in your practice? And then you can engage in a much more meaningful, I think, conversation than just trying to push out data, right? Because often people don't respond or react to data. They react to that kind of experience and that kind of emotional basis that underpins a lot of our decision making. We're all humans after all at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, how do medical affairs teams actually improve clinical outcomes? I know you both already alluded to this, but what are some tangible ways to think about this, or just maybe experiences that you've had or what you've observed? Eddie?
Yep, sure. I'm happy to start. So maybe two aspects that I think of. One of I had the privilege, to be able to work on COVID therapeutics, while we were, living through the pandemic, and really we were all learning as we went. It was a disease with no known cure, no known vaccines. But we, at least in the US, we have the opportunity to look to be able to get into pretty detailed databases and diagnostic databases, claims codes, sometimes even prescription databases, and you can pick a parameter as a baseline. For COVID, it was time from diagnosis to treatment. The drugs have been administered within 5 days of diagnosis, but you can get a good baseline of exactly what that gap looks like, and then you can deploy your medical affairs resources against that gap, and it could be through your medical science liaisons, it could be through we had medical Twitter handles back then, X handles now. We had medical websites, and you can measure over time whether you're impacting that parameter, and that actually gives you a hard metric. And a lot of those algorithms can be AI driven. It makes that decision making faster. And then the other piece is more, I guess, on the engagement side, where you can actually ask questions. Did the information I provide you help in your decision making? Was that relevant to your patients and the way you make your clinical decision making? So for medical, it keeps things very much focused on the clinical care, patient management type of things. You don't need to get into prescription data because I always used to say that medical should always be rewarded by also having patients not be on a particular therapy if they're not appropriate for that. Which is kind of a little bit contrarian, but nevertheless, it's an actually outcome that's very appropriate. So those are just a couple of my thoughts.
Okay, Sandra, I'd like to go to you and kind of maybe address some of those internally facing factors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I had alluded to it at the beginning, but I really do think if we put ourselves into the healthcare provider's shoes, how are they interacting with the industry? And you do hear these stories where they say, oh my gosh, I have 10 people from your company contacting me, and they're all coming at me from different angles, and big global organizations. There's some from global, there's people from the US affiliate. And I think if we really take the time and have the systems in place, the software in place to say, how are we capturing our interactions? How are we aligning our goals? What does this customer actually want to need? Deeply understand their practice. Who are they seeing? What are the challenges that they're facing? What kind of clinical outcomes are they trying to achieve? And then take a step back and say, how might we together collectively create the best possible experience for them and help them to achieve their clinical outcomes? And that is really about stepping back and saying, I don't own this patient, or this customer. I really want to work together. And all of us come at this with different skill sets and different value that we can provide. And so I do think that it can take extra time to sit back and understand these, particularly in these complex systems. But the more we do that, and then be very thoughtful about how we engage and the kind of information that we provide, ultimately, and most importantly, it helps the clinicians to create the best outcomes for their patients. So I think we can really do that, particularly around how we set goals. So setting goals together and then making them really transparent as well, and helping each other see, whether it's between sales and medical, what are we doing in these interactions, and in real time, as quickly as possible, explaining what we're hearing from customers and capturing what they want and need.
Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, what I'm kind of taking away from that is being collaborative and more intentional about everything that we do, and tying activities to outcomes. Right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Continuously. And that's certainly an interest of ours at Amedea Pharma, and in our approaches, which we'll share in a little bit. But I want to also talk about some published articles from in the recent years that show how medical information that we distribute and disseminate in the industry actually translate into decisions. Okay, so the majority of our healthcare professionals, they actually use this information for decision making, for diagnosis, as Eddie mentioned earlier, right? In discussions with patients and educating patients. So even if we're not directly educating patients, through the information that we disseminate, we impact patient care and patient outcomes. Okay, and so here, from the same research based on a survey of 500 HCPs from Rutgers University, we see these top clinical benefits that are direct on healthcare quality: educating patients, clarifying dosing, patient comorbidities, patient populations, and others, as you see here, ensuring access to care. Okay, and so these are some of the direct benefits that we have, and that we need to acknowledge and be proud of in the industry, but also continuously improve in the future. So the next part of our discussion that I'm interested and curious about is, yes, we have demonstrated this. We have a strong track record of improving quality. Well, how do we do it in a reproducible way in the future? Okay, how do we implement quality improvement in medical affairs? Okay, similar to, let's say, in R&D, right? You have a deviation from a protocol, and you have quality assurance. And so how do we do that in a more systematic way? So this is the feedback that I would love to have from the audience, as well as from our speakers. We talked about the specific case studies that Eddie mentioned, but here's some more data, which is confirming these perspectives from our HCP community as well, which Sandra spoke to earlier, in terms of this quality that varies substantially based on this recent survey. 150 KOLs who receive conflicting or redundant information because they see this themselves as well. The lack of our internal coordination based on how we're structured, or based on compliance and the restrictions that we place on ourselves as well. 44% of KOLs acknowledge this lack of internal coordination. And so how does that really play out in terms of the quality that we provide in the service? And so based on the published reference, the data there from Rutgers, there is a specific medical interaction outcome survey that we have developed as one strategy, for example, to approach this at Amedea Pharma, which asks 3 questions that are all interdependent. How relevant that information is, right? What proportion of the patients does this affect, right? So the magnitude of that relevance, and then ultimately the clinical meaning of that specific interaction. How did it impact your clinical decisions. And all of these choices are based on that research, and it's a 1-minute type of survey that you can continue to generate in the future. Okay, so that you're able to improve your internal operations, but ultimately also communicate that information, and build a database of quality data, right, internally, and potentially share that feedback with your customers as well. To whom you're providing a very critical, important service that's often has life or death implications for patients, right? And so the ANCORA decision assistant platform is one particular strategy that allows you to implement quality improvement by this deep metrics approach, more precision, more detailed analysis of your performance that starts by quantifying your activities by impact, capturing that quality feedback, as I mentioned, in this particular approach or others, from HCPs, from patients, from payers, as it relates to your organization, then ultimately pivot more often, make more dynamic decisions based on strategy that you update, and then start the cycle again. And so that is the kind of the approach that we're using in order to raise new standards in healthcare quality together with the HCPs, and that's our mission at Amedea Pharma, which is focused on improving our role in that endeavor, of improving healthcare quality together. So I'll show very quickly just a snapshot, and for those of you who are interested, you can ask more questions. But just a snapshot of this platform and how it may be used in a way to improve your quality. All right, so I'm logged in as a team lead here, and you're able to see the impact over time that your team is making, individually as well as by teams, based on those benchmarks that you set, which you can configure. You have leaderboards so that those on your teams are able to be accountable for the impact, the ultimate impact, which you weigh, the progress you're making quarter over quarter, as well as team data here. And that survey that I showed, right, the medical interaction outcome survey, is a specific survey that can be tied to particular campaigns or insights, where you can look at, let's say, the first quarter of this year and see various different campaigns and how you are performing, your team, patient diagnosis survey, or efficacy insights, based on those 3 questions that are scored, as well as the 4th question, which is simply a specific response of how that information improves the quality of care. Okay, so this is a particular dashboard that you can implement. Medical productivity index in terms of general feedback on performance as well as on behavior, how your HCPs see your teams collaborate, be coordinated, respect them as individuals, as HCPs, as not only as KOLs whom their company has asked them to see, right? And performance, how they utilize technology and the data to think critically, right? That's the medical productivity index, as well as the customer experience score, based on different types of customers that you may have: HCPs, study investigators, patient advocates. These are different types of dashboards that you're able to see, and also capture the surveys, edit, and customize, configure them as well. All right. So those are some of our approaches here at Amedea Pharma. But I'd like to now go and to the speakers and ask them to share their final thoughts as well. Before we go to questions from the audience, and I know we have a few comments. There's another one coming in now. So in terms of implementing a future quality improvement that's continuous, that's systematic, what are some of your final thoughts? And I'd also like to ask Jeff, we can start with whomever would like to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, happy to go. I'm very passionate about ongoing iterative change and how do we continue to improve over time. I mean, I think we have to do that, and things are changing so quickly. And obviously with AI coming on board, how do we implement that into the system? How do we have software help us move forward? And I think realistically, it comes back to that alignment but it's also internal alignment, right? So how do we help our most senior leaders understand what's happening on the front lines, right? How do we help them understand exactly what we're hearing every day when our frontline people, whether it's MSLs or MedInfo, our first line leaders are out there talking with our customers? How do we take that information about what's getting in their way of delivering a great experience and value for our HCPs and actually bring that back into the organization, have that heard, prioritize that work that's actually going to change. Either it's going to enhance what they're already doing that's working well, or really remove some of those barriers. And I think the more that you can get a systematic way to do that, and then have from the very top leaders all the way through understand what the problem is, the magnitude of it, and how we might be able to change it, and then really put the resources behind it, that can make a huge difference. And the way that we do that is making sure that we have a transparent way to see what our goals are, how are we tracking towards them, and then when we don't achieve them, because sometimes that happens, if we're ambitious enough, we shouldn't be achieving all of our goals, what's getting in our way, and that can really drive that continuous improvement. But to do that, you need to be able to have a system that allows you to see what the goals are and have that transparency across the organization, within medical, absolutely, but then across the organization too.
Well, thank you, Sandra. Eddie.
Yeah, very much to build off what Sandra was saying, and that those numbers you showed from that paper still show the gap, right? Because nearly half of respondents aren't using the information that pharma's are giving them. So to me, that's where that continuous improvement comes in. And there's an element, right, of feedback in there that needs to happen. There needs to be a culture of continuous coaching and learning, and then reapplying those learnings. And then finding the reasons why, there's the internal links and coordination, and there's the external. Do HCPs not use medical info because the information itself wasn't relevant? Did they have to read through a 10-page standard response document when they would have preferred to have a little 30-second video clip? Was the way that information was communicated effective, or not? Was it in the context of other information they were receiving for alternative drug therapies? But all of that starts giving you a more holistic picture of how we can learn, how we can improve, and have that as a continuous culture of coaching and feedback.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. The coaching is also very important. Yeah, absolutely agree. Jeff.
Yeah, 100% agree with what Sandra and Eddie have said. I think you mentioned it earlier when you said, we need a systematic approach, and I think too often in medical affairs, we're too siloed. It's whack-a-mole, right? And we don't really look at our whole system. And so one of the things that I think, you're providing through ANCORA is that it forces leaders to look at our overall system of medical affairs and how we're collaborating and how the things that we're doing roll up to our overall, imperative objectives. And I think that's hugely important, even just within medical affairs. And then as Sandra was saying, to other departments as well.
Yeah. So alignment, right? Yeah. Aligning together in a systematic way. Yeah. Appreciate those comments there as well, Jeff. And yeah, I think just to summarize very quickly, I think, and you mentioned these points, I think, right now the technology and, the changing landscape is creating new demands as well as opportunities, right? Where with the coaching that we have, with the new ways to communicate, we can not just measure, but master the quality of the improvement. And transparency is not just an option anymore, given that you have ample ways to measure performance, but it's a winning strategy to be more effective and really partner with HCPs. And that may mean sharing that data once you get that feedback, right, internally as well as externally, potentially, so that they are able to see that they're partners with us as well, and they're solving problems together, which the data shows in the earlier research that I shared. They want to see that, to solve problems together. And then finally, of course, the trust. I think medical affairs, as all of you have mentioned, has a very unique opportunity to improve the perceptions of trust in the healthcare industry, right, through our critical thinking and reduction of biases as well. Okay, well, if you are more interested to continue this conversation about ANCORA, contact us at Amedea Pharma. This is my email information as well. Connect with me on LinkedIn. And also, we will have an upcoming webinar in April as well, translating medical productivity and corporate contributions into reward in medical affairs. We'll take a more internal look at performance then. Okay, and so now we have a few comments here as well before some questions that we have, and let's pull up this question here from Layla Cooper-Smith. In terms of what specific metrics or indicators you have used to measure improvements in healthcare quality. Okay. That's the first question. We'll take that first question before the technology-based question more. Okay. Which actually is broken down into two comments, it looks like. But I know, Eddie, so I know you have actually implemented a similar survey to the one I showed, right, at Pfizer. Can you speak about what the impact of that medical interaction outcome type of survey had? And what response you received from HCPs potentially, or what other metrics use, if you want to address that question.
Yeah, so we deployed it via the MSLs, whenever they had an engagement. So by virtue that they were already having engagements or having interactions and perhaps had a relationship with many, we were getting a response rate in the mid-30s, which to my mind is pretty good for a survey. And we were using that as a measure of effectiveness, really, and then trying to get as to what was underlying that, like I was saying before, is the way you get information, or is the information itself lacking, or is good in whatever respect. But the other aspect, I mentioned COVID, but to Layla's question, in the rare disease area, we also used AI to go back to electronic health records and come up with an algorithm that specialists could use, because typically in rare disease, time to diagnosis is years, right? And we put together working patient advocacy organizations and some of those physician or healthcare providers, this AI-driven tool or algorithm that actually surfaced the potential for some of this rare disease condition. It's primary immunodeficiency in my case. But you can see then how you can start measuring impact, right, to Layla's. If you start reducing time to diagnosis, or you have, our target was a certain percentage of underserved patients increase in diagnosis of this rare disease condition. And we had a 5% target over 6 months, something like that. But you can start seeing then the impact that your interaction with healthcare providers is starting to have on the system. It's a very hard metric that gets you away from, I've had 50 interactions this month.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to build off what Eddie said too. Sure. It's really about impact over numbers. And I agree. I mean, I know back in the day, we used to look at that, how many people came to an educational program, that sort of thing. And it's really becomes much more about the why than about, what we're doing, and how we're doing it is really key too. And I love that about rare disease. We did some similar things around, particularly on underserved patients. And I know in the US, there's a lot of work on that. And you can have some hard tangible metrics. We did time to first infusion, and we did a lot of work through patient support programs. So some co-creation with actually creating a brand new patient support program with HCPs, everything from the enrollment form to how the process worked, to how we interacted with their staff in their office to make it the best possible experience. And all of those measures had metrics to them to make it as seamless as possible, and so that it was easily integrated into what they were already doing. Again, anywhere that we can remove friction or barriers in the system, the better for HCPs and the better for patients. So I think anything that you can put in place around those kinds of metrics can make a really big difference.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you both addressed, I think, the second part of her question as well, Layla. So thank you for those examples. And second example was about AI, how you've implemented AI, machine learning, to transform medical affairs teams. Yeah, and
that one too after Eddie, because I do have a story about that as well.
Okay.
Yes, just a quick comment on the AI, because it also ties into what Carol's asking around emotional. I think we're only scratching the surface, right? I'm really interested in the application of AI to measure like function and expression, like we're doing now, right? You can do that over time, and you can start getting at emotion or expressions like of pain, functionality, and AI can help you start piecing that together. If a patient has Alzheimer's, for example, you can measure gait, you can measure mobility, and you don't have to rely on written numbers or written words. But it starts, I think, capturing for medical affairs. Imagine if you could start doing some real world evidence that's based on images and video technology, rather than here's another CRF that somebody has to fill in. So I think the opportunity there is significant, and to Carol's point, that it starts also capturing emotion as well.
I want to pull that question.
Yep.
Yeah, but
And it's
pulling
very rudimentary, right? We still have those pain scores where you had those little faces and you were asked to circle how you felt, right? And that must have been around for 30 years at least, I would have thought. But imagine what we can do now with this technology and with AI. So that was a little bit of a passion rant.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, just so that I kind of I give justice to the comment here, I want to show it to the audience. And Carol's pointing out how important it is to quantify a lot of that qualitative data, right? And which Eddie mentioned. And I always, by the way, Eddie, I bring that example also, the visual analog score, how we have been able to validate that score over time, something as abstract and as qualitative as that. So we in medical affairs also have to be, I think, more creative in how we systematically turn a lot of the qualitative work that we do into numbers that we can reproduce and improve over time. So, sorry, Sandra. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I was just going to say real quickly, I think this will advance quicker than maybe we might anticipate, because in addition to what Eddie said about video, you can analyze audio, and we already have things like sentiment scores that look at word choice and that sort of thing. So I think there will be advancements coming.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to add, because I completely agree with both of you. And I think there's an opportunity for us to take that very messy system that we looked at the beginning and use AI to our advantage. So, I mean, one obvious example that the industry is moving towards is next best action. So really, how do we take all of the inputs and everything that's happening in the system and then provide our frontline people who are, they're going to see people trying to decide, how do I best use my time, our energy, our resources to create the best possible clinical outcomes, and equipping them by sort of taking all of that messy input. There's so much data there, and saying, based on what we know and what we can now extract from the system, here is how we could best add value to healthcare providers. And what we're finding, and I know certainly we were doing this in my last role in the organization, was we were getting some really great feedback from customers to say, you brought me exactly what I needed at the right time that I needed it. And the only way that we were able to do that was to leverage AI to look at all of the data that was available in the system and really hone in on what was going to add the most amount of value.
Yeah, I have one comment and a question to add, and that is related to patient access very quickly. And that your comment there, Sandra, triggered me to talk about the agentic, the evolution of the agentic AI, right? These assistants that are helping pharma companies, for example, even in negotiations with payers, understand what patient population, how to, what that best action is in that negotiation with a payer. But apparently the payers also have their own agentic AI that they're using in order to combat that or maybe restrict that. So my just question is, do you believe that medical affairs and industry leaders need to invest more time in training so that they know how to compare and evaluate different models and what engines run behind those AI models as well? Does that mean more data science training? Yeah.
And honestly, how a model is trained inherently can have bias in the training. Yeah. So I think the more that we can input and have it be evidence-based and rooted in fact and science, I think is more important. And the reality is, I hope we don't get to a point where there's no human in the loop, right? Yeah. AI is a tool, and the reality is, to make the best possible decisions, we can get the data. It's very good at synthesizing data, right? Large volumes of data. Let's take that down to the essence, understand it. You can remove the bias from that. But ultimately, there will always be a place for medical information for MSLs. And in fact, what we found was when we were starting to look at go-to-market, where do we want to be 5 years from now, 7 years from now? What we actually found was our customers want to see medical more than they want to see anyone else. And so to me, the future of medical is very, very bright, and they want to have that human interaction. They just want it at very specific times in very specific ways to add the most amount of value. So unlocking that, how we can figure that out. And I think AI can help us do that, but I don't ever see it replacing us altogether, whether it's with payers or with HCPs. We just need to understand what's happening behind the scenes with those algorithms to make sure that they're accurate.
Great. Thank you very much, Sandra. Are there any other final comments on redefining what true partnership is with our healthcare community? If any other final comments? If not, we'll wrap this up. Thank you very much. Those of you who have watched this, share this with HCPs. Let's get their perspectives, your colleagues, your friends. We'll send you the recording and some research as well, bonus materials, publications, and the slides, those of you who registered. Anything else, Jeff, Eddie, Sandra? Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was great.
Thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, really important topic. Thank you for hosting, Tim.
Thank you. My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Okay. Bye. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.